Hey everybody, like, share, subscribe. I've been off on our book club readings, so we got to get back into it. Trilateralism. We dealing with the secret society of the Bilderberg group. And I really apologize for this. So we going back to the 1950s. Four Bilderberg meetings were held in the first 2 years. Each began with a review of important events for the West. At the second Bilderberg in March 1955 at Brazion in France, during the post-Stalin-thaw and Cold War and before the border summit meeting between the U.S., USSR, Britain, and France, Bilderbergers discussed communist infiltration into various Western countries. Moves to ban communist parties were in full swing in a number of countries, notably West Germany successfully and Australia unsuccessfully, but very intimidating. On the same theme, the second agenda item was political, ideological, economic relations with the uncommitted for or against the USR nations. This was 3 weeks before the first meeting of non-aligned nations in Bandung, in Indonesia. At the Asian African Conference held in Bandung, countries first pressed for international recognition as a group of non-aligned nations, that is, neither aligned with the West nor the Soviet Union. The conference established principles of economic cooperation to foster third world development. Western elite. Oh, okay, that's the end of that. Where was that at? In September 1955, in Germany, Bilderbergers discussed whether further moves towards European and Atlantic cooperation or integration were possible through the structure of the NATO military alliance. NATO already provided joint military planning among 13 European nations and the US and Canada, and the West Germany had just joined. 8 months later, NATO's top political meeting of foreign ministers of North Atlantic Council appointed 3 of their number to report on how to extend NATO appointed to extend NATO non-military cooperation and develop greater Atlantic unity. It was busy 3 days. Participants also dealt with European unity as a separate item, political, strategic, and industrial aspects of the atomic energy, reunification of Germany, East-West trade, the expansion of international trade, and last but not least, the political aspects of convertibility of currencies. Following up their concern with the Bandung Conference of Non-Aligned Nations of the year earlier, the May 1956 Bilderberg meeting devoted itself to the causes of growth of anti-Western blocs, in particular with the United Nations. Western elites have grown increasingly upset with the idea that the United Nations is no longer ruled by Western powers, the United States. This frustration is registered with Bilderberg as well as the Trilateral Commission. About Bilderberg's process, Carolyn Moorhead observes no invitations go out to representatives of developing countries. Otherwise, you would simply turn it into a mini United Nations, said one person, a Bilderberger, with scorn. And more revealing, we are looking for like-thinking and compatible people. It would be worse to have a council of dopes. Moorhead, an exclusive club member. The common approach by the Western world toward China and eminent nations of South and East Asia, the communist campaign for political subversion or control of the newly emancipated countries of Asia. No room there for defiant speculations that the Asian liberation movements might be in fact nationally based, much less legitimate. The time set for the Geneva Accords for elections and reunification of Vietnam was approaching, and the West was involved in counter-revolutionary warfare, overtly or covertly, which means in the open or secretly, in Vietnam, Malaya, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Any criticism heard by Bilderbergers at this meeting, and it is hard to see who might have offered it, did not affect the later escalation of the war in Vietnam by the U.S. government, whose foreign policy posts were dominated by Bilderbergers and Council of Foreign Relations members. Kennedy, Johnson, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Russ, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, and CIA Directors Alan Dulles, John McCoy, and Richard Helms were all Council of Foreign Relations and or Bilderberg members or participants. There it is. There it is. Indeed, Kennedy and Johnson administrations with Bilderberg Council of Foreign Relations guidance shifted U.S. military priorities from superpower confrontation to Third World counterinsurgency, making Vietnam their test of manhood. Although unsuccessful in Vietnam, counterinsurgency led to the installment of numerous pro-West military regimes in Latin America and Southeast Asia. Shortly after these discussions of the West's problems with the Third World, President Nasser of Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal and the Suez Crisis erupted. Egypt had been effectively a British colony since the canal was built, but the British puppet regime was overthrown by moderately nationalist officers in 1952. In September 1956, the British, French, and Israelis invaded Egypt without U.S. participation, with the aim of toppling Nasser and installing another puppet regime. The United States refused to support the invasion, forcing the aggressors to retreat and adhere to UN resolutions of conflict. Not surprising, when Bilderbergers met 5 months later at St. Simons, the French, British, and Americans also came to blows over the Suez when they discussed what the agenda simply called the Middle East. Concern over the state of the West is a constant Bilderberg theme. The Suez Crisis was a perfect example of the disastrous consequences of disunity in the Atlantic allegiance. Meeting in Italy in October 1957, Bilderbergers explored unity and division in Western policy and looked into developments in tropical Africa. In the late 50s, there were serious disagreements between the United States and European speakers about the importance to the West of holding Chinese islands, Quemoy and Matsu, the president of Taiwan. A bit later, the issue of trade with Cuba also produced heated debate. After Francis Gary's power CIA U-2 spy plane was shot down, provoking cancellation of the 1960 Kennedy-Khrushchev summit meeting, Bilderberg discussed the world situation after the failure of the summit. Wow. In addition to the political disagreements about the Cold War strategies, technical matters of the military structural capabilities and tactics were discussed frequently at Bilderberg meetings. In 1957, the subject of modern weapons disarmament in relation to Western security topped the agenda. This was soon after Henry Kissinger's book, The Council of Foreign Relations, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, were published. Well, he has passed away, and he was the Illuminati himself, Henry Kissinger, and that's who groomed Obama. At this conference, Bilderberg stalmate Dennis Healy, later Britain's defense secretary, arranged funding for the London-based Institute of Strategic Studies, which began operating in 1958. The renowned International Institute of Strategy Studies was headed by François Duchesne between 1969 and 1974. In 1958, the whole meeting was given over to the future of NATO defense, and in 1961, the question of leadership of the West was split into discussions of NATO in the world policy of member countries and the role and control of nuclear weapons within NATO. Problems arose over the creation of the common nuclear policy for alliance with the European finger on the trigger. The British and French were determined to sustain independent nuclear deterrence. The U.S. opposed this, pushing Europe-based conventional forces instead. At the 1964 meeting, NATO's strategy and sharing of responsibility for nuclear deterrent again came up for debate. In March 1966, Bilderbergers again discussed the question, should NATO be reorganized? If so, how? The following year, NATO governments finally came forward to the American position and adopted officially a NATO strategy, flexible response, meet force, like force. This meant more conventional troops and non-nuclear weaponry. Official doctrine until then was massive retaliation to any incursion. But by the latter 60s, this automatic Armageddon had lost much of its credibility. Just like Trump pulled us out of NATO, I was so happy to hear that they ain't shit, they not for us. NATO was deeply involved in the process of West Germany's Ostpolitik, which entailed the formal settlement of German boundaries and the final ending of World War II. Then it became the theme of the 70s. Nixon and Brezhnev signed the first SALT Treaty in 1972. That's the U.S. and Russia. In May 1973, in Sweden, a conference on European security and cooperation was then underway, so the Bilderbergers spent a session discussing their conflicting expectations about it. Eventually, in 1975, it produced the Helsinki Agreement. Oh, we in conclusion. Oh, I might as well keep going. The 1960s. Each year, for particularly in early 60s, Bilderbergers argued that the implementations of growing economic strength of the EEC, Common Agricultural Policy, which prevented the U.S. from selling its farm surplus within the common market in order to foster internal agricultural development, was causing conflict. The U.S. hoped the common market would be seen as part of the process toward global tariff reductions. See how long we've been dealing with tariffs? Tariff reductions and increased economic integration. French obstructionism was a major Bilderberg preoccupation ever since President de Gaulle had vetoed British entry into the EEC and had withdrawn from NATO military planning. American worries about Europe becoming an independent, goalless superpower was aired. The balance of economic power in the West was shifting. See how this shit been going on? Throughout the late 60s and 70s, Bilderbergers discussed internal as well as external security and stability. In 1968, Bilderberg was scheduled to take up the issue of internationalization of business, but other issues were bearing more heavily on participants. President Johnson had announced his retirement to coincide with the initiation of peace talks on Vietnam. The student revolt in France was to bring that country to a halt within a fortnight with worker support. Having missed the boat in its programming for 1968, Bilderberg attempted to catch up in 1969 by addressing elements of instability in Western society. At that meeting, participants also worked through disagreements in the West over the handling of the 1968 Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia. See, Russia keep doing it. In 1970, just before Nixon Kissinger invasion of Cambodia, which toppled Prince Shavonic and produced a storm of anti-war protests on and off university campuses, Bilderberg set themselves to strategically considering the future function of the university in our society. Numerous Bilderbergers were involved in education, from U.S. participants involved in Paul Sampson, MIT professor, Graham Tilson, Dean of Kennedy School, Harvard University, all these people. The possibility of change of the American role in the world and its consequence was another central agreement of the post-war economic system so carefully architected by the Bilderbergers and other elite planners. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment.